All right, let's go through some more slides here. This first one is a picture of what's called a stela. I've heard this word pronounced a few different ways, stela, stella, stele, all by people who seem to know what they were talking about. I'm just going to stick with the word stela for the sake of consistency. That's the first word. Stela is a large commemorative stone that usually has an inscription in it, a shallow relief carving or something, just like this one does. It doesn't look like it's all that impressive, but if you really look down here and see it's 6.5 feet tall, that's a really big rock. And it's supposed to commemorate the victory of Naram Sin over his enemies. And you can tell which one is Naram Sin here if you look, because he is the biggest person here. Now, a system of denoting a person's importance through scale is called hieratic scale. It's a hieratic scale. The bigger a person is, the more significance they have. The bigger something is, the more important it is. Hieratic scale. Um, you can see how much smaller his vanquished foes are here. This is his following conquering army. Interesting thing here, this entire military victory just never happened at all. It's all propaganda, but this is a stela, and it displays hieratic scale. Now, this is the area, the ancient Near East. We're going to be focusing attention right over here. This is the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley. You can see it's called Mesopotamia. It's the Fertile Crescent, uh, the birthplace of civilization, which has actually become a contentious term now. People are making arguments. They have found proof of well-developed civilizations in other places, but we're just going to focus our attention right here. If you look down here, this is actually the Nile River Valley. The Egyptian kingdom was down here, but we're going to focus our attention right in here. Um, the reason that Mesopotamia became the cradle of civilization is because of those rivers specifically. Remember, the progression of culture from Paleolithic culture to Neolithic culture was one that was focused on agriculture. And if you have agriculture, you're going to have fertile soil and you're going to have water. And this was about the only place in this area that had both of those things. And these rivers not only provided water, but they would also flood seasonally. So they would provide mineral-rich silt. They would deposit that on the riverbanks, and it was one of the few places in this area that you could successfully grow crops. They developed irrigation systems that would extend that even further. Now, when you start to have these groups of people that would flock to this area to grow their crops, they eventually begin to pile up on top of each other, and all the different civilizations essentially had to have one larger governing body, had to have a shared language. You had to have some sort of social structure. There was a lot of things that were created for the first time here in this area because it's the first time you've had that many people all trying to live amongst one another at the same time. So let's see what's next. Now, one of those firsts that we see here is a organized system of religion. Now, this tall figure here is supposed to be Shamash, who was their primary god. These are the votive statues, which are just a form of paying religious tribute to Shamash. These would have been found in a temple, and they were basically placeholders. A wealthy citizen would go to an artisan who would make them a clay figure, and the more money they had, the more they would pay. The person who had this particular sculpture made sure spent a lot more money on it than whoever had this one made. But it was a sign of their dedication, of their tribute. There's a lot of debate about why they have such great big eyes. It's really creepy. There are two primary theories. One is that since they're worshiping, you can tell by the clasped hands here, oh, clasped hands, that they're praying, and they're in the process of praying, and their eyes are open because they're in awe of the presence of their God. What doesn't make sense there is that this is supposed to be Shamash, and his eyes are also great big. So who is he in awe of? The other theory, the one that I tend to put a little bit more credence to, is that there's the whole cliche, the eyes are the window to the soul. Well, that is a belief that has existed for a very, very long time. And for someone to be so open about bearing their soul, they're essentially trying to say that they are pious and they are pure of spirit, including Shamash here. This is one of those things that it kind of shows up. There's a couple more times in history that we'll look at that this whole great big glaring alien eyes thing becomes popular again. So I mentioned that those votive figures would have been found in a temple, and that just happens to be what this thing is. Now, the whole structure in its entirety is called a ziggurat, and that's this word right here, a ziggurat. It's a large slope-sided structure found specifically in the ancient Near East or the Near East. There's still some of these around that have a temple on top. Now, they do look a lot like pyramids in some regards, but they are different. They're very different. One, in that the ancient Near Easterners didn't build pyramids, but they did build ziggurats in the same way that the Egyptians did build pyramids, but they didn't build ziggurats. So the location is a really good indicator. The second clue that you have is the fact that, well, this is a temple. Um, Pyramids are tombs, at least the Egyptian pyramids are tombs. Tombs were meant to hold dead bodies, and temples were meant for worship. So there are two primary differences. And if we look here, you see this one's a little bit more intricate. This is a very smooth-sided ziggurat. They typically were a little bit less clean-edged than this. You look at this one. I do like that they have a guy standing here. It gives you a good sense of scale. It's a massive structure. Still small compared to the larger of the pyramids. The Egyptian pyramids they're absolutely massive. They would dwarf something like this, but this is still a really impressive structure, especially considering that it's just sort of it's growing up out of the middle of the desert. You know, there's this whole series of religious beliefs about the significance of mountains and about these large structures we're building being synthetic mountains. But what you might notice is missing from this one is that temple that's supposed to be right there on top. It was intentionally destroyed at some point. There's been a lot of contention in the area, and things get destroyed and they don't always get repaired. But this is a really good example of a ziggurat. So, the Stela of Hammurabi. This is another commemorative stone. Be sure to watch the video that's in this section about the Stela of Hammurabi. There's a really interesting narrative that's at top here. Notice we're also using hieratic scale. This is Shamash again. Oh, I lost my cursor. There we go. There's Shamash again. And he's much larger than Hammurabi. If he was to stand up, he would just completely dwarf Hammurabi. But he's sitting down in this particular image so that he can see eye to eye. It's very valuable because what he's doing is telling Hammurabi what his laws are. So if you look really closely here, and they explain this in the video, that's the inscription itself. Now the video explained a lot more about that, but the one law that I feel is absolutely most important here is the one that details the exchange of power from one generation to the next generation. When one ruler dies, his eldest son is supposed to take control of the throne, which doesn't seem all that spectacular or well thought out in today's society. But at the time, well, before these laws were put in place, um, or really before the stela itself, you would have a ruler and he would have laws, and he might have a law in place that dictates that when he dies, his eldest son takes power. But when that ruler dies, nobody has to listen to his laws anymore because they were associated with him. By detailing that Hammurabi is receiving these laws specifically from Shamash, an immortal being, he's essentially saying that these laws transcend humanity. These laws aren't my laws, they're the laws that everybody has to follow essentially forever. This is how the Babylonians established such a dominant empire, is because they were able to establish a sense of stability from the transition of one ruler to the next ruler to the next ruler. It was actually a really big deal at the time. Be sure to watch the other video. So, okay, this is what's called a limasis, uh, or lamassu, depending on the context. But um, this is associated very closely with Assyrian culture. Um, it's where current day Syria is. There was a civilization of people that were called the Assyrians, and they were a very, very impressive group of people. They were some of the first in the area to really master metallurgy, and they used that to immediately start making weapons. and they got really, really good at developing really well-standing military, which was something that wasn't common at this time. But they realized that they didn't really care about farming so much. Like farming, kind of boring. It's like we could sit around and grow our crops all day, or we could just build a lot of weaponry, develop a standing army. We could just go take whatever we want from all the other civilizations, and that's exactly what they did. So they were big and scary, and eventually they realized that they didn't even like having to walk to go places to get whatever it is that they needed. So they developed a system of basically intimidation. Their entire society was built around intimidating all the other people around them, the other civilizations. Their economy depended on other people being scared enough of them that they would just bring you bring that if we're hungry, then they're going to bring us their grain. If we need more gold, then we're just going to threaten a few people and have them bring us theirs. Um, that this is reflected in this particular piece two ways, well, three ways. One, the size of it. Thing is massive. There's a photo of one of these with a lady standing next to it in the section below. This thing is 10 feet tall. So one, the size is intimidating. Two, it's a winged lion figure with the head of a man. So it's superhuman. It exists in some, metaphysical realm or something, but then it has the face of their ruler. So there would have been about 100 of these things lining a corridor on the way to the temple where emissaries would be brought to meet the ruler for negotiations. So, as they were being led down this corridor, they were seeing one after another, these monstrous figures with the face of this man, this superhuman figure that they're about to meet. So, by the time they were in a place to negotiate, they were already intimidated. It was really what their entire economy was based off of, and they got really good at it. They established an empire that was based off of intimidation and well military power. So this continued several generations. Asur Nasr Paul here. They've got it's they've got kind of funny names, which is a shame because they were such well, really terrible people, kind of. They were just very bloodthirsty, or at least that's what they wanted everybody to think. Here he is in the back of a chariot just mowing down lions. That's a pretty awesome legacy to leave behind. And as of this one, Assurbanipal is Assur-nasirpal's son. Um, he had a story spread about him that he was so callous and bloodthirsty that every morning when he enjoyed his breakfast in his garden with his queen, here he is. There's my mouse. There he is with his queen. That his servants would bring him breakfast, and they would have a prisoner of war impaled on a tree in his garden, so that as he was enjoying his breakfast, he could enjoy the sounds of them screaming for mercy. Was this true? It probably was not. But if you were a neighboring empire or neighboring kingdom, you wouldn't want to find out the hard way that it wasn't. If you look really closely, I'm just now noticing that you can see where the faces of both of these figures have kind of been picked at. This is actually really common. Even in Egypt, there's a lot of defamation of sculptures, as it might just be an act of protest, but a lot of times one ruler would take control, and they would try to erase the influence of the previous rulers, because the lasting legacy at the time was in the inscriptions, it was the sculptures, it was these permanent monuments, and if you could destroy that, then eventually you could just completely erase a person's memory, or memories of them. But anyway, those are the Assyrians. That's one that I'm fascinated by the Assyrian culture. Now, as the last thing here, um, crenellations. That's crenellations. I'll have to write that down somewhere. But that's these zigzags that you see on top, what you see at the top edges of medieval castles. Those are called crenellations, and they were basically just used for defensive purposes. It was a place that you could put an archer on top of a roof, and they could stand behind, the tall points and fire out between the little niches there. But it was for defensive purposes originally. But the Babylonians, when they started building, they realized that they really just liked the way it looked. This particular place here that uses so much crenellation is called the Ishtar Gate. It's one of the primary entrances into Babylonia, and this is a reconstruction. This is actually inside of a museum in Berlin today, but you can still visit and you can go in there just like it was, back thousands of years ago. I think that's all.